Hi, everybody. Welcome to Stratosphere Lounge. I'm Bill Whittle, and sorry about that. We had a situation where Petula just wouldn't be quiet. And, the show wouldn't be the show if we didn't lead off with all kinds of groovy technical errors. We're playing with the lighting now. Welcome to Stratosphere Lounge. I'm Bill. I really ought to take this a little more seriously someday. It's great. It's great to be back, and we've got another one of our Pictures Worth 1,000 Words editions of our Stratosphere Lounge today, which I think is actually turning into kind of a fun show. It really is an interesting thing sometimes, the power of imagery is, some of the things I talk about, the power of imagery, and so I had to go to that TSR logo because I couldn't get Petula to be quiet, and if she's talking, I got a bit of a violation with the YouTube folks. I actually looked into what it would cost to buy that theme, and it's not so cheap, actually. But just a couple things before we get started. One of the reasons the productivity has been a little low on this end is we're in a state of perpetual flux here, just getting everything ready for a move. Certainly going to be moving, I think likely going to be moving our studio stuff, so we're trying to set up a situation where it'll be a little easier for me to do daily type content. One of the things I need to do over at billwhittle.com is I have to provide a few more member benefits, and I'm actually thinking about doing a daily show, like a little 3-minute show. I don't know what I'm going to call it yet. I might call it 2-minute drill. I might call it 2-minute warning. I might call it whiteboard. But I think what I've got to do is I definitely have to do something for the billwhittle.com members. And it can't be something, I feel very strongly about this, it can't be taking away anything. And I don't want to take away anything that people have already gotten for free. So it doesn't mean that Stratosphere Lounge has to be, members only. We're not going to do any of that stuff. But we want to do something that's, provide some value for the membership. And it's got to be something relatively easy to produce. So I think what we'll probably do is a daily show called Whiteboard, or maybe, like I said, 2-minute warning. And I'd just be in front of a white screen and talk about the stuff that's going on in the news of the day, just kind of a little daily update on what's going on. And if I do it, I might do like just a clock countdown. And somebody just wrote, a Precious Snowflake just wrote, we should do a members tour if we go to LA. That'd be really fun. In fact, it'd be fun to set up little membership chapters and come out and visit them too. So that'd be cool. Over the Target, Wild Goose calls it. That's a great idea. And an even better name is Time Over Target. Time Over Target is awesome. Time Over Target. Wild Goose for the win, or at least for the partial win. Time Over Target is awesome. Time Over Target, I may be, the nice thing about having people who really do this for a living, is I often get corrected, and I like getting corrected when I'm wrong about things I shouldn't be wrong about. But I'm pretty sure that Time Over Target is a term used to coordinate airstrikes. So ideally what you want to do is you want to have basically have all your assets get there as quickly as possible so that you overwhelm their defenses. And time over target might be, you got guys coming in from 600 miles, you got guys coming carrier that are 320 miles away, and their time over target is the time that you want them to be on that, time on target. Thank you, time on target. That's even better. See, I told you, it's great to be corrected by people that know what the hell they're talking about. I knew the term, I just couldn't quite place it. Time on target is basically, if you're coordinating a series of airstrikes, you want your jets over the target at a specific time. And the reason that you want that is because, number one, you want to overwhelm the defenders. Number two, you don't want all your assets over the target at the same time. And my understanding, this is one of the coolest things I ever heard, actually. My understanding was that during Gulf War, the strike packages were coming in so fast that first night in Baghdad when they took down all the air defenses, that the guys just looking down at their displays, and certainly the guys in the AWACS who were controlling all this stuff were just looking down, and it was just a solid sheet of incoming strike packages and outgoing strike packages, and that's a time on target is. I'm getting more. A time on target apparently. All right, so actually, why don't we get a vote on this? The person just corrected me on this, is that time on target is an artillery term. Because I know this stuff, I just getting a little confused. When you have, it's a similar kind of concept. Apparently, time on target is when you have 15 different tubes at different locations. You want to have them all fire so the rounds hit at the same time. You can actually nowadays, with one artillery tube, you can fire, I think it's 5 or 6 rounds, and they'll all hit the target at the same time because you're changing the elevation. So you basically fire a round that goes in a very high parabolic arc, and then a second one that's a little bit lower, and a third one a little bit lower, and so on. And if you can get those rounds off fast enough, they all hit the ground at the same time. But something like that, I'll look into it. But that's a great name. In any event, okay, so now we got it straight. Time over target is in aviation. Time on target is artillery. We're going for time over target. So there it is. But it'd be fun. Rich B says, I'm a Navy sub guy. We sink our targets. Yeah, you bet you do too. Mark 48 swim out torpedo and not even make a launch transient sound. So I'll play one of those two. But either way, it's going to be one of those two. And I really like it, and it'll be cool. And it'll be daily stuff for the membership. And it won't be the big stuff. We'll keep the firewalls free. And we're going to start kicking the firewalls out too. I'm going to give them a new look. Give them a, keep the same basic vibe, but give them a new look and update everything. So anyway, that's the latest, and we're just in this state of flux, getting the space ready. But that daily stuff has got to be something easy. It's got to be something I can just knock out. Yeah. Somebody, Brent Kate says that might hurt somebody, and I don't want to be accused of that. I don't want to be accused of mass murder. So anyway, great idea, and thank you for that, Goose and guys and everybody else. I was looking for a name that I liked, and that's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. What's weird about this thing, by the way, is that as I've probably explained to you before we get into the actual show, I get what I'm looking at when I do the show is I'm looking at a monitor here, and it's given me real-time feedback of what I'm seeing that's going out. And then off to that side over here, I have a window, which is the playback, which is what's coming down from Ustream on the stream. And that's where I see the comments in the live stream when we do the show live. And those of you watching on YouTube don't get this fun experience. But the color difference is really significant. In other words, what I'm seeing on my monitor looks color balanced, and every time it comes down, it looks jaundiced, and it looks jaundiced on YouTube, and I can't worry about that right now. But one of the things that would be nice about our new space is we might be able to actually completely light this thing and get a camera, put it on the wall, and have to not worry about this stuff. So I could just do it right into the camera, and that might be a little bit better. So anyway, we'll be improving the Stratosphere Lounge too. So we've been a little behind the curve on new content on a lot of things, but it does look like we're going to be able to get this Common Sense Resistance thing done as a low-budget film with real special effects, and I'll have some artwork for that too, some cool stuff for that too, I think. So that'll be coming up. All right, well, so we got a lot to do today, and I thought we'd just start with the pictures. Pictures Worth 1,000 Words, edition number 62 of the Stratosphere Lounge. So let's just go to them, and some of them are from last week, but I have to start off by saying this is maybe the most amazing and awesome thing I've ever seen. Honestly, I just actually choked up over that. Thank you so much. I grabbed him in a big hurry. I didn't get the name. I'm so sorry, but actually, I like that so much. I think I'm going to just make it my Facebook homepage. I mean, it's just bloody marvelous. Thank you so much. Let me explain. I think the Reagan's probably self-explanatory, but just super fast. Let me tell you about the George Washington thing, because I got a pretty good idea where that came from. I've done a lot of speaking. I don't know if the person who made it, and again, many apologies that I didn't get your name. I wish I had it. And if somebody can put it in the comment section and I catch it, I'll be happy to say it. Especially interesting about this is the George Washington thing, because when I talk to people about changing our message and our imagery and the way we view things, I used the Tea Party as an example. You say Tea Party to young people, and they think it's a bunch of old women sitting around having tea. They don't know anything about the fact that it was a bunch of half-drunken young American patriots chucking boxes of the King's tea in the river because they didn't like a 1-cent tax on tea. And I said, I think that this idea that we have as conservatives, especially Tea Party conservatives, using iconography and imagery from the revolution is a mistake. And I think it's a mistake because I don't think young people understand it. I understand it, and you understand it, and that's why it means something to us. So when I see a guy dressed up as George Washington, I love it. But what I try to explain to young people, and I think this is very effective, and I say it to Tea Party groups too. I say George Washington, for those of you who haven't heard the story, I'll just give it to you real quick. During the Revolutionary War, which went on forever, Washington wrote a letter to a tailor in London. It's his arch enemy, basically. Wrote a letter to a tailor in London and basically said, I would like to purchase 4 waistcoats in the latest styles using the most popular colors, and I'd like the buttons to be as ornate as possible without appearing ostentatious. And I was so fascinated by that message until I realized, as my friend Jeremy Boring pointed out, he told me that story, George Washington was the best-dressed man in the world. He was the best-dressed man on planet Earth. And I say to young people, if George Washington were standing here next to me, he wouldn't be dressed in a waistcoat and frilly collar and powdered wig and be carrying a musket. He would be standing here. Was he 6'4"? He's a giant. He'd be standing here next to me. He'd be wearing a $2,000 Armani suit. He'd be wearing $1,000 shoes. He'd have a $900 haircut, and he'd be carrying an AR-15 with a laser target designator because he was a swinging, deadly dude. And that's what George Washington was. He was the best-dressed man in the world. If George Washington were here today, he wouldn't look like this. He'd look like the best-dressed man in the world. He'd be wearing Italian suits, open collar, and he'd have an AR-15 because he was deadly and he was cool. And when you say that to young people, they get it. They do. They get it. It starts to have an effect on them, and they start to think about things a little bit differently. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about kind of changing the packaging and the messaging. It's about getting things accessible today. And if the liberals keep talking about the future and we keep talking about the past, we're going to lose, and we deserve to lose. We got to make the case that conservatism is the best answer for the future. And also, concurrent with that, you got to make the case that progressivism is an ancient philosophy of failure. That Cicero in 55 BC talked about, Gaius Gracchus in 150 BC, saying that if we give people free food out of the grain reserves, then no one's going to work, and it was a catastrophe. Gaius Gracchus tried it in 150 BC, buying votes with largesse, with entitlements, and 100 years after that, in 50 BC, 2,000 years ago, Cicero said, we tried this 100 years ago and it was an utter failure. So there is one new idea in the world, and it's what we call conservatism today, which is otherwise known as classical liberalism. And, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. But we got a lot to do today, so we're going to move on. So that was fully awesome. And again, I'm so sorry I was in a rush as always. I didn't get the name of this, but I am going to put this up there. Dan Ramsey. Dan, you are... Dan, I got to tell you, it's a great picture. It's great iconography. But to be honest with you, what it did to me personally, seeing that, just the emotional effect that had on me, Dan, I mean, really, it really choked me up. It meant the world to me. Thank you very, very much for that, Dan. I'm gonna use that in the future, and I really appreciate it. It was a great image. Speaking of badasses, and speaking of me being on the road talking about things, here's something else. I've got a Tea Party speech in Ramona that I haven't put online yet, but I will. And I was talking about a new iconography, and I've repeatedly talked about how awful the GOP logo is. It's just absolutely awful. And I said I would actually just reverse the colors on this. Other than that, it's bloody perfect. And I said, we've got the... Our logo is the elephant. The elephant is the most powerful animal on the earth, and parenthetically, probably the most intelligent land animal on the earth. And this is our logo. We've got this giant, massive creature with these giant tusks, and he's huge and he's powerful, and the GOP uses this little square-footed thing with this little vestigial kind of a trunk, no eyes. It's completely... it's blind. You know the GOP logo that I'm talking about. It's appalling. It's appalling. And I said, we've got the elephant. Why don't we do a picture of an elephant with its eyes on fire and its head down and its trunk blaring and it's charging and it's, and it's just freaking on fire, and we've got the most intelligent animal, and the Democrats have, by all accounts, the stupidest animal. Why? And the official logo of the Republican Party should be "Don't be an ass." And I think that is how you fight these people. You get out in front of them. And we don't have any pride on our team. But that was a really nice rendering. Thank you very much. I think I might have put the head down just a little bit more. But I don't want to naysay it, because I appreciate the work that went into it. It was terrific. And you can see that if you start doing stuff like this, people will start to pay attention. They'll perceive you differently. They'll perceive you as being proud and being, like cool. Imagine. We just, God, that GOP logo is just awful, awful, awful. If I was a Muslim sympathizing socialist traitor who wanted to make my opposition look bad, I couldn't do a better logo than that. It's just absolutely appalling than the existing one. This was great. I really liked it. Thanks very much for that. I think that's really, really cool. It's the kind of thing we should be doing. Hey, speaking of badasses, let's do 3 in a row. Look at this guy. That, of course, is Sir Winston Churchill in the dark days of World War II, when everybody thought the world was ending, and they were right. And I've spoken about him many times. I've read the trilogy of his life 3 times through now, and I think he's the most remarkable man who ever lived. He's certainly the most remarkable man of the 20th century, and I'd put Ronald Reagan second there. But there's a couple interesting things about this picture. First of all, when it was taken, Joseph Goebbels took this picture, made flyers out of it, and dropped him over Germany and called him that great gangster Churchill, that criminal Churchill. And they had to pull that campaign out pretty quick, because everybody realized it made him look tough and serious and badass and kind of a problem. So they pulled that propaganda campaign right away. What else do you need to know about Winston Churchill than expressed in this picture? To really understand the background of this picture, you have to understand the context of what happened right before it. I think this was taken very early, probably 1940 or 41. Winston Churchill had inherited not just an office or a government. He had inherited an empire that was utterly defeatist, and had been utterly defeatist for 15, if not 20 years. Had been defeatist since the end of the First World War. And every single person in the British government, Macmillan, I guess it was Macmillan, I used to know this, and I need to know it again. Obviously Chamberlain, and prior to Chamberlain, it wasn't Macmillan. It was I've got it on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, just tremendous defeatists, and when Hitler rolled over France, Winston came to power just as France was falling. He literally assumed office as France was going down. They thought France would last for years. France lasted 6 weeks. And now Churchill, whose entire war knew how badly prepared Britain was, understood and had been screaming about how badly prepared Britain was, watched the Luftwaffe gain in strength every year, watched them cut budgets to the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force and everything else. And the biography is called The Last Lion, since somebody just asked. That's fantastic. The Last Lion by William Manchester. Terrific. And he watched all this. He knew it was coming. But even then, Churchill assumed that with the power of Hitler and the weakness of Britain, he assumed that France, which had an enormous army, and the Maginot Line, the French had more fighter planes, I think, on the front line than the Germans did. They had 850 airplanes. Nobody knows where they were. They were not engaged in combat. Nobody knows. After the war, there was a big inquiry into what happened to the French Air Force. They just never took off. But Churchill had assumed that even though he knew he was badly outnumbered and outgunned, he at least assumed that he'd be fighting the Germans with the Germans based in Germany. But 2 weeks, 3 weeks after taking office, and he flew to France a number of times. It may have been 7 times, under Luftwaffe air cover. He just got in a plane and flew over to France repeatedly, trying to buck up the French leadership. But Churchill thought that he'd be at least fighting the Germans from Germany. And think about the shock that must have been after 2 weeks in office, 3 weeks in office. He's figuratively or literally standing on the English Channel, and realizing that German bombers don't have to fly 200-300 miles to get over Britain anymore. They can take off from the airfields he can see across the channel. Likewise, the fighter planes can be launched from across the channel. And likewise, the U-boats could be launched from across the channel. And the U-boats didn't have to come out of the North Sea and do all this other stuff. He not only had lost France as an ally, but Germany was now literally 20 miles away. And so all of these things are context for this picture. But you know what? I'm gonna find the quote, because the quote is too good to boggle. So give me 1 second while I do this, because I'll come back to this image. But honestly, he's the greatest man who ever lived, in my opinion, and all of us owe our freedom to him. Because honestly, if he had not made a decision to get up in the morning and fight these people, I don't know if America would have been able to get in the war without that aircraft carrier called Great Britain. Hang on a second. I got to find this quote, because it is perfect, and I don't want to mangle something this good. Oh, I can't find that on Facebook. I'm going to find it up here. Give me a second. It's worth it, believe me. Because he made a speech to Parliament right after France fell. And I'll play for you. I'll read it for you. Here it comes. It was 1940, May of 1940. France had just fallen. It was a war cabinet crisis. And he said... let me find it here. Boy, it's say 10,000. All right, I got to find it. I hate this kind of thing, but believe me, it's worth it. Here it is. There's that guy, fat little man in a jumpsuit. Out there facing the fall of everything he believed, the fall of everything he loved, facing the fall of all of these things. And he got to the Parliament, and a lot of people in Parliament, oh, for the love of God, a lot of people in Parliament were trying to basically, urge him to surrender. And surrender was the smart play. It was the smart play. And if I had this prepared, I would have it in front of me right now. Oh, for the love of God. Yeah, I've got 15 different paragraphs. I know everybody's probably giving it to me. I'm going to find it. Hang on a second. It's here somewhere. This is really embarrassing. All right. He basically says, we are going to fight them. This is not to fight them on his speeches. But basically, here's the line. Okay, the whole thing is actually pretty good. But here's the line. Here's what he said. He basically said, if this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. Here's surrounded by people who for 20 years, 25 years had been saying that you can't fight this guy, and that you have to surrender, and that we can manage Hitler, we can understand Hitler, we have to find out what Hitler wants, all this stuff, and all of a sudden this man walks into Parliament and says, I will basically die with a machine gun in my hand. Okay, you know what you got then. You know what you got. So there it is. I think he's the greatest man ever, and we certainly need guys like that, back again. We certainly do. He's just, I think, the most remarkable man we ever lived. And finally, I think the final thing I'll say about this is simply this. We know that times are bad out there, and we think that, this may be the end of everything we love and so on, and maybe it is. But we are facing nothing like what this guy decided to face. And if he hadn't gotten up every day and decided to fight these people, then I don't know if we'd be here. So what a great picture. What a great man. personally fearless, and there you go. So that's Winston Churchill. Here's another British badass. That's Sir Frank Whittle, inventor of the jet engine. There was a German engineer whose name eludes me at the moment, but he was also working on the jet engine, and I think Sir Frank got his jet engine working first. But I think the German jet aircraft actually flew first. I get asked about this a lot. Obviously, we must be related somewhere, but we're certainly no close relations. We're not related in any way that I know of. I know that if you go to a town called Wigham, up in Lancashire, it's like every fifth name up there is Whittle or something. It stands for the White Hill region. But nope, not related to Sir Frank, other than spiritually, I hope. A remarkable guy, and like most remarkable prophets, was utterly ignored by the powers that be. One thing that was kind of interesting was when I first saw the Thunderbirds in 1965 flying F-100s. I went down to the toy store in Hamilton, Bermuda, and we happened to, by just sheer coincidence and sheer luck, there was a pre-built plastic model of an F-100 up on the ceiling, so my dad bought me that. And then we bought a model kit, and the model kit, what's the chance of this? 1965 in a tiny little store in Bermuda. But the model kit, the plastic model kit, was for an airplane called the Gloucester Whittle, and I guess my dad must have noticed that. And the Gloucester Whittle was the first British jet airplane, and real ugly, like most British aircraft, I'm sorry to say. With the exception, of course, of the Supermarine Spitfire, which is in fact the most beautiful airplane ever built and makes up for all the rest and more. But the Gloucester Whittle was a little single jet engine aircraft, test aircraft. I don't know what year it flew. It might have flown as early as like 1939 or 40, but I want to say it was about 42, 43, well before the end of the war. Needless to say, the British didn't get any jet aircraft in the war in any meaningful way, and neither did the Americans. I forgot the designation of the American jet fighter as a twin-engine jet, and they put a mock propeller on the nose when they were towing it around, because they were just so worried about what people were going to think. They didn't want anybody to know they were working on an airplane, didn't have a propeller in it. So that's kind of a cool story. And the Gloucester Whittle was an interesting little airplane, and I don't know. I think Frank Whittle's an awesome guy. As usual, if the authorities had listened, the British would have had a jet fighter up there, and they didn't. And Frank was screaming the whole time, and they wouldn't give him any development money. They thought the whole thing was kind of a joke. And Hitler, for his for his many flaws, I mean, he's a monster, but he was a monster whose plans for world conquest he knew were dependent on his technological edge, because he knew Germany had nothing like the manpower to do this unless they had huge technological advantages. And so Hitler put huge amounts of stolen Third Reich money into jet aircraft, into rockets, and so on, and produced amazing designs. Really amazing what the Nazis were doing and about to do. But obviously it's too little too late, thank God. The Me-262, they had another operational jet. I want to say it was the HE-163, maybe? Single-engine little airplane with an engine mounted up on the top. Looked a bit like a V-1 buzz bomb. But obviously the Me-262 was the German fighter that actually did get into the war in the last couple months, 6 months, maybe a year of a war. The Me-262 was 100 miles an hour faster than the P-51 Mustang. It was using a jet engine designed by the Germans, and at 100 miles an hour faster than the other fighter cover, you are almost exclusively immune. You really, if you're 100 miles an hour faster, you can really do a lot. So that's what happens when you ignore guys like Frank Whittle. the Me-262 is one interesting little story about the Me-262 was that it had one weakness, and the weakness was the jet engine spooled up pretty slowly. And since they spooled up pretty slowly, it couldn't accelerate very quickly, especially on takeoff and especially on landing. And so the weakness of the Me-262 was they had to get it while it was landing. And that's exactly what a guy named Chuck Yeager did. I think Yeager got I think he got 5 airplanes in a day. He was an ace in a day. And Chuck Yeager has a remarkable line about the Me-262. And that is, and this is, Yeager is kind of a jerk, but Yeager's also a legend. And one of the reasons he's a legend is Chuck Yeager said, the first time I ever saw a jet airplane, I shot it down. And he did, too. He got an Me-262 that was on its approach to the airfield. And first time he ever saw a jet engine, he shot it down. It's pretty impressive, actually. So our line of badasses continues with this badass. And this was submitted last week. And, there you go. What do you say about this guy? There are war generals and there are peacetime generals, and they're different kind of guys. And one of the great problems of democracies is one of the reasons they get into wars is not that they initiate them, because my understanding is that a democracy's never attacked another democracy. That's never happened in history, I think. But one of the reasons why the Union, for example, in the Civil War, was so slow to get in the game, why the Army of the Potomac lost, 7 major battles, then 7 or 8 before they found their general, before they found Grant, and why the U.S. just got destroyed. In the unprepared in the Pacific, took us at least a year, to get guys into troop on the ground in Africa. And the first thing we did in Africa, the U.S. Army, was Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. And good Lord, it was a catastrophe. And it takes a while for these guys to come up. But George Patton is clearly one of the greatest generals in history. And not just because he's a great American general, but Patton was a guy who was the offensive. He was the offensive all the time, and all the great generals, all of them really are the ones who are offensive-minded. We just saw G. William here in the comment section said all the great generals, war generals, went to the South. That's certainly true of all the great generals prior to the outset of the war. Robert E. Lee obviously went to the South. Stonewall Jackson was teaching at VMI, I guess, and Jeb Stuart and all these other guys. The South, in the first half of the Civil War, the South had the generals. They had the leadership by a wide margin. And the North didn't. The North had guys like McClellan, who was a terrific peacetime general, really assembled the Army of the Potomac, trained it, equipped it, made it the most highly trained, most beautifully equipped army on the face of the world, and sent it out into battle again and again and again, and was so timid and so afraid of losing that he was just walloped. He was walloped in the peninsula in 7 days, and then he was walloped he fought it to a grudge match at Antietam, but he had Lee's battle plan. He had his orders, and he still couldn't beat him. So McClellan was just a complete weakling. And it took a long time for the Union to get their guys up from the ranks and from low in the ranks. At the start of the war, as I recall, U.S. Grant was a lieutenant. He was a failed lieutenant. He was a failed tanner. He had to borrow money and keep himself alive. I want to say he sold his sword he was in the war of, he was in the Mexican-American War, like so many of these other guys. And the Union just didn't have the talent. They had to find the talent, and the talent had to rise through the ranks. And U.S. Grant, obviously, Donaldson and Shiloh, where he kind of got caught red-handed, but nevertheless was a fighting general, and Lincoln needed a fighting general. Lincoln had an army that could beat the South. He just needed a general that was willing to use it. And I'll get back to Patton in a minute. But one of the things that's so interesting about Grant and Lincoln, it's an expression I'll never forget. Grant went in with everything he had and just won battles through brute force. It wasn't beautiful strategy and tactics like you had with Robert E. Lee and daring moves like Stonewall Jackson. And Grant just went in there and said, bring some guns up here, and pummeled him. And what Lincoln realized, it was either after, I think it was after Fredericksburg, must have been after Fredericksburg. Lincoln looked at this catastrophe, this Union disaster, this horrific rout at Fredericksburg, and he said, if we were to fight an endless series of Fredericksburgs with this kind of a whooping that we take, we would win the war. Lincoln realized even if everything we did from this point forward was a Fredericksburg, so long as we kept fighting Fredericksburgs, we would win the war. There you go. What Lincoln used, the term Lincoln used, was facing the arithmetic. He said he needed a general who could face the arithmetic. And facing the arithmetic meant that you could come to grips with the fact that we're going to lose guys 3-1 or 4-1 or whatever. But as long as we're ready to take those kind of losses, we're going to win the war. And the sooner we deal with it, the better we're going to do it. That was Grant. And probably the most moving story in the entire Civil War, and I'll come back to Patton, was because they're the same guy, really, when you get right down to it. Grant had come from the Western Theater where he'd had a lot of success. He'd captured Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, and those were the first real decent wins of the war. He did okay at Shiloh, and then he did the whole Western campaign. He got Chattanooga back and won some of those battles, and the entire Western campaign was basically orchestrated by him. And the West was winning. The Union was winning in the West. So they brought Grant forward from the West, brought him out to command all of the Union armies, made him a 3-star general, and left Sherman in charge of the West. And Sherman was another one of these aggressive. Sherman's probably the first modern general who understood that war was political as well as military. Anyway. Grant came out and fought the Battle of the Wilderness, which was on the same field as Chancellorsville, which was Lee and Jackson's great victory, and the one that cost him Jackson. So Vicksburg, obviously, Goose thanks. Vicksburg was the masterpiece. The Vicksburg campaign is one of the most brilliant campaigns ever, still being studied. So after Vicksburg, they brought Grant out to be general of the combined armies, and he fought his first battle as general in charge, although Meade was in command of the Army of the Potomac, on the battlefield of Chancellorsville, and they called it the Wilderness, and he was whipped. Hooker got whipped in the Wilderness a year earlier at Chancellorsville, but he had one flank rolled up. Grant had both flanks rolled up. And so the great story about all this is that the Union Army is marching home. This is their 6th or 7th general after 7 losses, and they come to a fork in the road, and the fork turns to the left where they go back to Washington, and they go back into camp, and they get re-equipped, and then another general comes back, and then they go down and lose again. But they got to the fork in the road, and they didn't turn left, they turned right. They were heading south. After this tremendous defeat, they were going to go fight him again at Sharpsburg. And when the troops reached that fork in the road, there was a cheer that just went down the line, and it took hours and hours and hours for that army. And these guys in the Army of the Potomac realized they'd just been whipped by Robert E. Lee. Grant got whipped in his first battle out, and Grant was going to go fight him again, and they knew that's when they were going to win the war. So that's a great moment. But let's come back to this guy. They're so similar in so many ways. Although I think, probably philosophically, maybe strategically or constitutionally, I actually think Patton is maybe more like Sherman, because Patton understood that if you move quickly enough and if you are on the offensive enough, you put the enemy into such a state of disarray that that they simply can't resist anymore. you can get Bedford Forrest, another Civil War general, so put the skier on them. You can get them to the place where they're so confused and so demoralized by the fact that you're advancing so fast, they don't even know where you are anymore. All of their forces sort of converge on your last known location, but you're just not there anymore. Now you're even deeper in the rear, and they just don't know where you are. It's utterly demoralizing. It's how you win wars. And Sherman made his famous march to the sea after Atlanta, but then his even more impressive march up through the Carolinas was a much tougher march than the march to the sea. And this basically sundered the Confederacy and convinced them they couldn't win. That's powerful armies just marching right through them at will, couldn't be stopped. And Patton did exactly the same thing with the Third Army in Germany. And the reason I picked the Patton thing was I wanted to get to that. And obviously a lot of people said he's real K. I'm trying to stay away from RK because some people think I'm talking about it too much, but it's about as K as you get. But there's something else interesting about Patton, and that Patton was fully aware of who he was fighting, and it wasn't just Nazi Germany. Craig Schlieve in the comment section, Patton was more, I think that he says that Grant was more like Eisenhower. I think that's probably true. That's probably a better analogy. Grant and Eisenhower are probably a better pair, and Patton and Sherman, if you want to draw a World War II Civil War comparison. But anyway, here's Patton cutting through Germany, and Patton knows that he can get to Berlin, that Berlin is easy. And I think one of the great catastrophes of the 20th century, I really do believe this. This is very clear in the Churchill book. Nobody really knows why. I think I know why, and I think most people would probably agree with this. But Patton had the ability to get to Berlin way ahead of the Russians, days if not weeks ahead of the Russians. In fact, was hell-bent on getting to Berlin well ahead of the Russians. Churchill maintained that the Allies had to take Berlin ahead of the Russians, or else the Russians would get the credit for the whole war, they at least internally. And of course, the Russians did stop the Germans. Most of the German might went against the Russians in the east. But if they had been let alone, Patton and Third Army and the British coming up from the Aegean would have recaptured Berlin. The British would have taken Vienna and most of the rest of the Iron Curtain, and those countries would have been free countries. They would have been free countries and not part of the Iron Curtain. But he was stopped. Patton was stopped by direct order from Eisenhower, and Churchill couldn't understand it. And Roosevelt, needless to say, said, "I'm not going to muddle with what Eisenhower says." But he basically stopped Patton, prevented him from taking Berlin. He said that Berlin needs to be taken by the Russians, political considerations behind it. And nobody really knows why. I think that if you look at the upper level stuff that was going on, I think if Truman had been president long enough to have been really in his shoes, I don't think Truman would have stopped Patton. I think Truman would have let Patton go. In fact, it would have encouraged Patton to take Berlin. But Roosevelt, I guess, must have obviously had the approval, or else Eisenhower couldn't have stopped him. But Eisenhower insisted on stopping him. And so the question is why? And I think that when you really get down to it, if you look at the way Roosevelt treated Stalin, Roosevelt suffered from the same kind of intellectual elitism that we see today. Roosevelt said many times, "I can handle Uncle Joe. My personal charm," let me know if any of this is familiar to you, "my personal charm is so great that who doesn't like Franklin Delano Roosevelt? I'll just manipulate him, and I'll get him to do what we want him to do." And Churchill knew what Stalin was, and Roosevelt, to his undying shame, sold Churchill out, laughed at Churchill in front of Churchill, laughed at him, made jokes about him with Stalin. And Roosevelt was wrong, like they always are. Winston, the four big progressive presidents are also the 4 progressive presidents that have never understood warfare, because progressives can't understand warfare because there are selected people. Woodrow Wilson had these ideological goals and ideals that were never going to happen. Franklin Roosevelt felt he could manipulate the Russians into doing what he wanted through force of personality. Lyndon Baines Johnson had the Vietnam War essentially won or winnable, and then he would stop. He'd bomb the hell out of Hanoi, and then he'd stop. And the reason he stopped was, he says, as a means of showing our goodwill. Well, you've just bombed the living daylights out of the enemy's capital. I don't know that a show of goodwill is going to do you a whole lot good right now, LBJ. But he kept calling off the dogs. We're going to have these rules of engagement that are going to keep things fair. Really? Our guys don't have guns on our airplanes in Vietnam. And they do. And we have to do visual identification before we can engage. We only have missiles, and the missiles aren't very good. Yeah, keep flying the same Ingress routes over the same targets at the same time, because we don't want to upset the Vietnamese as we are locked in an 11-year war with them. So what do you expect? What do you expect? Finally, Nixon comes along, and finally Nixon gets to the point where he says, you know what? We're going to bomb the living daylights out of these people. Started bombing Hanoi, and they came to the peace table in, 10 days? So what it all comes down to with this picture is this. There is I called it a meme, and I was corrected last time. I guess it's probably identified as a photo macro. But it was a picture of Einstein, and it had, that Einstein quote, you cannot simultaneously prepare for and prevent war at the same time. Nonsense. That's the only way you prevent war. And what's interesting to me about this is people will go to Einstein and take Einstein's advice about war because Einstein was a brilliant guy. And people just assume that because he's a very, very, very high IQ physicist, that means he must have that kind of insight into things like politics and war. We don't go to Einstein for fashion advice. We don't go to Einstein for dating tips. We don't go to Einstein for hair care suggestions. And why we would go to Einstein over issues of war and why people would quote Albert Einstein about something he knows nothing about is an indication of the power of elitism. It's the same thing that infected Roosevelt when he stopped Patton. We know better. It's the charm of our personalities. We're so much smarter than everything else. This man knew what the stakes were. He knew who he was fighting, and he knew who he would have to fight. And he was a product of the times. And Patton understood what Stalin is. Not who he is, what he is. He understood what Hitler was. He understood all of these things. He had a simplicity about him that gave him moral clarity and clarity of purpose. But George Patton was one of the most well-read, brilliant men on the face of the earth. Patton was not he wasn't, Uday Hussein. He wasn't a guy who had an army and just like an idiot. He was a scholar. He was a warrior, scholar, priest kind of guy. He understood all of this. He understood the history, and you can't leave this picture without talking about the movie. George C. Scott was brilliant. George C. Scott absolutely captured the essence of him, captured the mystical warrior aspect of Patton, the idea that Patton could walk in North Africa and stand on the ground of Carthage and understand what happened there, and understood what happened earlier at Cannae and what had happened with Hannibal, and understood that human nature doesn't change, understood that all of these things are timeless and eternal, and when it comes time to fight for your life, it comes down to guys like George Patton and Ulysses S. Grant and Hannibal and guys like that. So we are breeding this out of our society at our peril. We are breeding this out of our society at our peril. And we don't let boys be little boys, and if little boys can't go up and hold up a stick like a gun without somebody hyperventilating and calling the police and banning them from schools and giving them a criminal record for the rest of their lives, we will not eliminate violence and crime. We'll just subvert it and suppress it and make more of it. And if you don't let little boys be little boys, we are going to run out of people who know how to do what needs to be done when things are no longer rosy. And it's a fundamental belief of mine and probably of most conservatives that rosiness, happiness, prosperity, and security are not the default state of mankind. So govern your child's play accordingly. Moving on. I had to take this because it was so beautifully phrased. There were a couple pictures later of the airplane itself, but I just thought this was just genius. And that was a great way to get the thing into the picture's worth 1,000 words thing. So yeah, I don't know if there's much I can add to I can get off of this picture anyway because, needless to say, it's clever, and there it is. I was asked a couple questions about the Malaysian airliner thing because I'm just a private pilot. We have people out there right now in the comment section. Commercial pilots know a lot more than I do. Wild Goose is one of them, but he doesn't get to talk on the microphone, and I do. So I'll say a couple things, and I'm sure I'll be corrected where I'm wrong. This is one of the great mysteries of the modern era. All I know is all I know. So before we start, let's just say I'm not an aviation expert. I would say I have good working knowledge of aviation. The Boeing 777 is an extremely reliable airplane and a very long-range airplane. That's the first thing I think you need to understand about the 777. It is a world-spanning aircraft. I don't know how fully fueled that aircraft was, but a fully fueled 777 essentially can go anywhere in the world very nearly from one point to another. On the other side of the globe. They're very long-range aircraft, or very efficient aircraft, and obviously extremely well-built aircraft. So when the plane went missing, I didn't believe that it had just broken up for no reason. That just doesn't happen. Planes just don't break up for no reason. The Air France flight that first came to mind when I heard about the Malaysian flight being missing was that Air France flight where they had icing on the pitot tubes. I did an afterburner about that called Into the Sea. And that was an Airbus aircraft. And basically, I didn't know this until I started looking into it. That Airbus, all Airbuses apparently, I still can't believe this is true. But what apparently happened during the Airbus accident where the Air France airliner left South America, I guess it was on its way back to France, basically flew into the ocean. They just flew it into the ocean. And what had happened was they had a relief crewman, co-pilot, in the right seat. And he couldn't make any sense out of his instrumentation because the pitot tubes, which measure air pressure, had frozen up. And the jet was flying fine. He just couldn't make any sense out of it. And so he started to come back on the stick and slow the airplane down and got it to stall speed or nearly stall speed. And then I'm not going to get into all the details of this because we talk about Air Malaysia. But basically, the Airbus has two different flight regimes because it's all flight by wire. The computer determines what the control inputs are going to do. There's an emergency regime which allows more input than there's the normal cruise regime. They didn't know which regime the software was in. And this I did not know, and it blew my mind. But apparently, in the Airbus, if the pilot in the left seat is saying, "My God, we've got to dive," and he pushes the stick all the way forward, and the co-pilot in the right seat says, "Oh my God, no, we've got to climb," and he pulls the stick all the way back, the plane averages the two inputs. That's absolutely insane to me. Insane. At a Boeing, the control yokes are physically locked together. They're sending fly-by-wire instructions, but the pilot's not doing one thing and the co-pilot doing something else. Absolutely insane. I couldn't believe my ears when I heard it. So I had thought that the Malaysia airplane had some kind of a situation where the flight crew was distracted and probably just flew it into the ocean. Or immediately you start getting reports of suspicious-looking characters on board. Okay, so there's a bomb and it blew up in midair. That would not have surprised me. And so then you hear reports of an oil slick, and I think, okay, well, that's what happened. It was terrorists blew it up in midair, or maybe it was like the Egypt Air flight. I think that was a 767, where the pilot of an Egypt Air airplane basically was suicidal, started screaming Allahu Akbar, pushed the control column forward, and took the airplane and everybody behind it into the ground. I thought it was one of those two things. Either people had gotten a bomb on board the airplane and blown it up in the sky, one of those three things. Three, Spanish Inquisition, three things. they'd either blown it up in the sky, had the kind of accident where they couldn't figure out what was going on and essentially flew it into the ocean somehow, or pilot suicide probably for religious reasons and just pushed the plane into the ground. Now, I didn't know this because I'd heard about debris, but turns out that wasn't the debris. And so I came late to the story, and I still don't have all the details. But by all accounts, that airplane made what looks like, this is the latest, 90-degree left-hand turn and flew for some time. They were looking for it in the South China Sea, but now they're looking for it in the Indian Ocean. So what does that tell us? First of all, for those of you who don't have any background about this, airplanes have a device on it called a transponder, and a transponder is actually kind of misunderstood piece of equipment. Transponder is basically a radio transmitter, and when a radar beam sweeps the airplane, when it receives a radar signal from the ground, it detects that a radar beam has swept it. Two things happen. The radar beam from the ground actually gets reflected back to the ground, but it doesn't tell the radar guy anything other than the bearing. It doesn't even tell him the altitude. It just says at a bearing of 045 degrees from this radar station, there's something out there at this range. That's what radar stands for, radio detection and ranging. So radar, without the transponder, gives you a heading and a range. It's 23 nautical miles away on a bearing of 068 degrees. That's all the radar can tell you without the transponder. Ground-based, simple radar. Now, what the transponder does is the transponder, again, is a kind of a radio transmitter, and when it detects that radar sweep coming past the airplane, and that can happen several times a second if there's enough beam sweeping by, then when the transponder detects that radar signal from the ground, it also, at the same time, transmits information, and that transmits information out in an expanding sphere. It doesn't just send it back to that particular station, it just sends out a radio signal. And that radio signal says, hi there, we are on this transponder code, 4-digit code, which is assigned by air traffic control. And this code also includes altitude information. This is how high we are. So that information is then read by the ground computers, and when they see a transponder code set to, let's say, 4702, then the ground radar knows that 4702 has been assigned to a particular flight for the duration of that flight, and on the little screen it will show up as, United 612. So when they turn the transponder off, which can be done with the flip of a switch, just like that, when the transponder goes off, you no longer get the information on who the airplane is and how high it is. And the primary return is much, much harder to spot than the transponder. Transponder is sending out a good, strong signal. Parenthetically, before I go on, I should tell you that virtually every, you may have this out in bush planes, but essentially every airplane in general aviation in America has a transponder. You're required to have one within 30 miles of LA and other large airports. And so your question is, how do you have all of these transponders out there with these different numbers? And the answer is most of them don't have different numbers. Virtually all general aviation flights have a transponder code or squawk code of 1200. By the way, transponders don't go up to 10. They only go up to 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 0. It's 8, decimal 8. There's an old system. So when you're flying along VFR in America, you're squawking 1200, and so are thousands of other airplanes out there. It's like, well, we don't know who this guy is. We don't know where he's going. I like that about this country. It's still a free country. I know how high he is, but we're not talking to him, is what you'll hear from air traffic control. There's a guy at traffic at 2 o'clock, 2 miles, we're not talking to him. We don't know who he is. So you can turn the transponder off immediately, and that means that the altitude information, the flight information, all that stuff goes away. But the primary echo doesn't go away. The primary return still shows up on the radar. So in order for this thing to disappear off of the radar would mean that, first of all, there'd have to be radar coverage. I don't know if radar coverage extends that far out to sea. I just don't know the answer. I suspect it probably doesn't. But let's just say it did. The only way that this airplane can actually physically disappear from radar is for them to turn the transponder off, number one, and number two, they got to get down low. Because once you get lower, you start to get underneath the curvature of the Earth, which would be the limiting thing out in the ocean, Over land, you can start to get things called ground return, ground echoes. Things like houses and mountains and trees and stuff obscure a radar signature low, which is why now when you want to penetrate enemy air defenses, you don't fly high and fast, which was called the high safe sanctuary. Lovely term. If you were at 70,000 feet in Mach 2, Mach 3, they figured they couldn't touch you, but they could. The high safe sanctuary doesn't exist anymore. Now, in order to get under radar and not be detected, you either have to have a stealth aircraft like a B-2, or you have to come in under the radar. And so if they were within radar range at the time that something happened, they could have turned the transponder off right away, and that would have taken most of the information out. But the primary return is still here. So it seems to me that if they were in radar coverage, they had to dive the airplane to get it below radar range. I think there's no question that the plane was hijacked. I just don't see any possible explanation other than that. I know I'm making breakthrough news here, right? But when the plane makes a left-hand turn, basically flies 90 degrees off of its course, something has happened. And I think what probably happened was these. If I had to guess, I would say that the two suspicious characters who came on board late got into the cockpit, forced them to a different destination, which, if I had to guess, would be Iran. Whether or not the 777 had the range to get to Iran, I don't know. Somebody knows. Somebody knows how much fuel was put in that airplane. One of the problems with flying very low enough to be under the radar, is that an airplane like a 777 simply doesn't. It loses all of its range. That aircraft has a very long range, dependent on it being at 30,000 feet or 38,000 or whatever. At 30,000 feet and above, the air is so thin that the drag on the airplane is very slight compared to what it is down near sea level, and the efficiency of the engines reach full efficiency. At sea level, airplanes have to go to much higher power settings in order to stay flying, and they simply cannot reach those kind of speeds that give them the kind of range at sea level. They just can't do it. Because up at 30,000 feet, what indicates 250 knots is actually 500 knots because the air is so much thinner up there. So if they thought that they could get the plane low enough to stay under the radar and still make their destination because they'd calculated the range of the 777, it's possible that these people were stupid enough to say, well, the 777 has a range of 8,000 nautical miles at a full fuel load, and we're only 6,000 nautical miles away, no problem, or 4. Let's dive to get under the radar, and we'll take her out, we'll come in at, 2,000 feet. At 2,000 feet, a 777 won't have that kind of range, so it could have just splashed it into the Indian Ocean. Another thing I'll say about this airplane is this. This I'm convinced of. I don't know if anybody's ever made this argument. Surely they must, because, like I said, I haven't been following the story very closely. But one thing I can tell you is this. A 777 is a big airplane. And you do not gracefully set that down on an open field, and you don't set it down on a grass strip, and you don't set it down on a little airport. In order to land that airplane without serious catastrophe, I'm going to say you need 7,000 feet of runway. Somebody here knows more about this than I do is going to tell me in a minute exactly how much feet of runway is. I would say 7,000 or 8,000 feet would be the bare bones minimum. 737 can get in a much smaller airplane. You can get that into Burbank, for God's sakes. But a 777 is a big wide body airplane. It's damn near the size of a 747. And so if that airplane is intact and the passengers are still alive, that means it's on a runway that's got to be at least 7,000 or 8,000 feet. And I am here to tell you that if that airplane is still in one piece, then we know where it is, because there are not that many runways out there with that kind of runway length. We know where it is if it's still in one piece. I suspect it's not. If I had to guess, I would say it's either in the Indian Ocean or in the jungle someplace. And by the way, if you're looking for an airplane, my hope, if wreckage of an airplane, you'd actually think it might be easier to find it on land, but I'll bet you it's much easier to find in the ocean. Airplane hits the ocean at flying speed, unless you've got a dead calm river and a guy with the quality of Schellenberger behind the wheel, you're likely going to break that airplane up. And that means that debris is all going to scatter, and you've got a impact area that's hundreds of yards across at impact, and within a few hours it's miles long, and within a day it's 20, 30 miles long because of currents. So it's easy to find that kind of a slick out there. On the other hand, if an airplane goes into the jungle, likely it's so wet and the ground is so soft that you're not going to have much of a fire. And if you do have a fire, it's not going to last very long. If you want to hide an airplane's wreckage, Papua New Guinea would be a pretty good place. We're still finding airplanes that disappeared during World War II out there. An airplane going into the jungle or going into lush terrain, something like that, would leave a hole in the jungle the size of the airplane, and that's about it. I think the fires would be gone pretty early. I think if that airplane went into the jungles of Southeast Asia, there's a good chance you never find it, or you don't find it for years. With all of that said, just speculation, I don't think any of it's new. But I will say this is one of the great mysteries of the 21st century so far. I mean, it's really shocking that airplane of that size could disappear for this long and not have us know about it. And I have to tell you, if I had to guess, there's one more option on the table here, and that in terms of explanations, and that option is that we do know where it is, and we're not saying. And I think this may be a remote possibility. If we know where it is, we may not say we know where it is if we plan to effect a rescue mission. Certainly, if I was planning special operations opportunity to rescue an airplane's passengers, especially if they're in Iran or something. An Entebbe, basically, is exactly what you're talking about. I wouldn't want them to know that I know where the airplane is. I'd want them to think that I thought the airplane was in the ground. I wouldn't want them to know I knew where it was. I'd keep it quiet. That's possible. But I think the most likely case is that it was hijacked, that it was not bombed, that it was hijacked, and that it was taken off course, and that, if I had to guess, and that they had decided to go in low, and that the airplane didn't have the range low, and that it's somewhere in the Indian Ocean on its way to Iran. If I had to guess, that's what I would say. We'll find out, because you can't keep these kind of things secret forever. But that's what I have to say about the airplane. And moving on. It's a beautiful picture. Lovely picture. I knew what that was the second I saw it because of that big round spot up at 11 o'clock. You don't find islands that round. It's obviously not the Earth. There's no land masses there. It could have just been a fictional landscape, but I know what it is. That's Mars. And that giant round island up in the upper left-hand corner there at 11 o'clock is Olympus Mons. That's the biggest volcano in the solar system. And that was a picture of what Mars would look like if it had been either terraformed in the future, would be terraformed in the future, or what it conceivably could have looked like in the past. I don't think so. I don't think Mars had that much water on it, but it would be nice if it did have that much water on it. Let's go back to that picture again for a second. The whole purpose of the Stratosphere Lounge is to take a walk. It's not about being on topic. This whole thing's about just interesting connections. And one of the little interesting connections is that that volcano in the upper left-hand corner is the largest volcano in the solar system, far, far higher than Mount Everest. And it's called Olympus Mons, which is Mount Olympus. The reason I think it's interesting is that when it was first discovered, I want to say it was Mariner 9, it might have been Mariner 6 or 7, one of the first flyby probes. It wasn't called Olympus Mons. It was called Nix Olympica when I was a kid. And it was called Nix Olympica. That means snow of Olympus. It was there was snow on it. It was carbon dioxide snow, but snow on it. And I always remember Nix Olympica. But it is a gigantic volcano. And if you look at this picture, you can see that Mars is, in fact, extremely lopsided, just like the Moon is. The Moon, all the side of the Moon that faces the Earth, the near side of the Moon, is very different than the far side, very much lower. All the lava flows are on the Earth side of the Moon. And so Mars has an entire hemisphere that's far, far higher than the rest of it. And if you raise the water level on Mars, you put water on Mars and then raise the water level, you can get a thing that looks like this. So that's kind of just sort of the technical background on this thing. But I actually kind of regret leading with that, because the fact is, it's just stunning, isn't it? I mean, it's just so beautiful. Earth is far and away the most beautiful planet in the solar system. You see Earth from a distance, and it's just sucks the air out of you. It's so beautiful. The blues and the white clouds and the greens and the delicacy, the way the atmosphere bleeds off towards the limb of the planet. Earth-like biology is stunning. And the blue and the water and the green. This is a magnificent piece of artwork here, by the way. And when you look at Mars like this, you think this is what it could be someday. There's enough water in the solar system to put this kind of water on Mars. It doesn't have to be as deep as Earth's oceans. Oceans could be 60 feet, 80 feet deep, 100 feet deep. Obviously, it'd be deeper than that depending on the terrain and the lay of the land underneath the water. But there is water out there in the solar system. There's certainly enough water in comets to get you there, but you need a lot of comets and you make a lot of impact craters. Ceres, the largest asteroid, which we're sending a probe to. We had a probe at Vesta. Took some big pictures of Vesta as the first of the big asteroids, one of the original 4 asteroids discovered, and it's left Vesta now under its own power, weak little power, but it's on its way. Heading to Ceres, and the Ceres appears to be largely fresh water. I've heard estimates that say there's more water in Ceres than there are in all the Great Lakes in North America. That's a lot of water. It's probably not enough to get Mars up to that level, and certainly how you'd get Ceres to impact on Mars without destroying Mars is not going to happen. Mars is a small planet, Ceres is a big asteroid. But there's water out there, and you could do it. One of the things that's interesting about the idea of putting water on another planet and creating livable habitats is that you don't have to do, in fact, you probably couldn't do the entire planet this way, because Mars's surface gravity is much smaller than ours, about a quarter of ours. And over time, that gravity is not strong enough to hold enough of an air density or enough air density to keep the water, basically. The water's not going to fly off into space, but you need the atmosphere. And Mars doesn't have the gravity to keep that kind of atmosphere over geological periods of time. But if you kept bombarding comets into it, you probably could keep the atmospheric pressure up. But there's a better way to do this, strangely enough. And the way to do it is actually kind of self-solving. Rather than terraforming all of Mars, as in this picture, if I had to do it, I would take a decent-sized comet and I'd crash it into Mars, because if you made a crater deep enough, the air pressure at the bottom of the crater would approach 1 atmosphere. And so basically what you'd have is a planet that was essentially, the surface of Mars right now is, for all intents and purposes, a vacuum. It's about 1% of Earth's atmospheric pressure. Far, 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 far thinner than Mount Everest. Far, far thinner. So it's essentially a vacuum on Mars. But if you put a big old crater in it and you got down several hundred feet below the surface, the air pressure in that crater would be high enough, and you might be able to get it high enough to breathe, and you might get it high enough to put water in there. So what you'd end up with is a bunch of little pockets of open-air civilization, which you could connect through, channels and tubes and so on. You're going to make a big, big bang when you bring those things in there, but that's about the only way I could think of doing it. Unless there are, if there is a significant amount of, and I say significant, I mean planetary levels of water under the surface. We know there's some water under the surface, water ice. There's no question about that. The question is, how widespread is it and how deep it is? If it turns out that Mars once had oceans, those oceans, the liquid water is still there. It's just frozen under the surface. Then all you have to do is heat it up. Because if you heat it up, then that water's going to melt, and then the water vapor will sublimate, I guess. But soon enough, it'll raise the atmospheric pressure. And if you heat it up fast enough, you can get an atmosphere on Mars that's probably breathable faster than it can dissipate off into space, because that dissipation will take thousands, if not millions of years. So it's just an interesting subject, but terraforming is hard. And one of the things that I think is just an interesting subset of this question with Mars is something I've wondered about for a while, and that is that everybody talks about Mars, and everybody wants to terraform Mars, and everybody thinks we should go to Mars. And there's one planet in the solar system that's just forgotten. It's just not even there. It's not on anybody's mental horizon. It's not on anybody's map. It's just not there. And that's our sister planet. It's Venus. Venus is far easier to get to than Mars. It's much closer than Mars. It's interior to the Earth's orbit, obviously. Venus has essentially the Earth's gravity. Venus is a few hundred miles smaller than the Earth. It's a twin planet of the Earth, and no one talks about it. The reason no one talks about it is because Venus is living hell, but it doesn't have to be that way. Venus is, it really is, the porridge is too hot, the porridge is too cold. Mars is further away from the sun, and Mars has about 1% of Earth's atmosphere at sea level, 1% of Earth's atmosphere. Venus at sea level has 100 times the air pressure that the Earth has. So Venus is not only hotter than Earth is because it's closer to the sun, But Venus is far hotter than Mercury, which is much closer to the sun than Venus. Venus is hotter than Mercury because of the greenhouse effect of that atmosphere. It's not just that it's full of carbon dioxide. It's full of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide that's 100 times thicker than the Earth. Surface temperatures on Venus exceed 400 degrees Fahrenheit. It's hot enough to melt lead. It's hot enough to bake a pizza on the rock in just a few moments. So you have enormous problems with Venus, and unlike Mars, where you just want to get out and walk on Mars, it's essentially no more difficult than walking on the moon. You're just a vacuum suit. You're going to walk on Venus. It's enormously difficult. But if you're talking about long-term plans, if you're talking about terraforming, if you're talking about doing this, then Venus is maybe a better candidate, because Venus has the surface gravity to retain an atmosphere. Venus is a better candidate in some ways. One of the problems with Venus is that its rotation is very slow, and I think it's retrograde too. I think it's the only planet that rotates clockwise, looking from the North Pole down. Venus's rotations was something in 200 and some days, I think 240 something. That kind of slow rotation means you're in a rotisserie that doesn't turn very quickly. These are solvable problems. You could solve the problem with Venus's slow rotation by putting a solar shield up. It's basically cutting the amount of radiation up there. Just put it up in one of the Lagrange points, or put some dust up there, put some dust in orbit around Venus, cut the solar radiation to some degree. But look, the point is it's all problematical. And one of the conversations I had, when was it? I don't think it was on the air, but it might have been. Maybe it was. It was a Clavin Whittle episode, maybe. It was, yeah. I was talking about in this Aurora series, in movie 2, called Ice Station Ceres, we actually fight the Chinese in space. We have a water refining station on Ceres. And somewhere in movie 2 or movie 3, I wanted to have a character come in who's going to set up sort of a genetic split with humanity downstream. I kind of see a future where look, Earth-like planets are rare, and getting to other solar systems is virtually impossible. It's virtually impossible to get someplace within this solar system, but interstellar flight is orders of magnitude more difficult than interplanetary flight is. And so I thought, well, if you're going to have aliens, probably the aliens are going to be us. And I thought that one potential way to have aliens is to have aliens who are genetically, intentionally genetically mutated from humans. In other words, transhuman humans that basically, we have this technology virtually today. Human beings that lived in space and decided that rather than trying to adopt themselves to the environment to themselves, they decided to adopt themselves to the environment. And their position would be, I think I had a French geneticist come and talk to these people in movie 2 or 3, and basically say, you're trying to get to the solar system, and you can get to the solar system, but you dream of interstellar flight because what you really dream of is what everybody dreams of, which is setting foot on a new Earth, right? Setting foot on a new Earth. That's what this whole idea of terraforming Mars is. It's the power of this image, is that it's a place where you could get out and walk, and you would have a new world, just like America was a new world, a place where you could just be free in space. You just walk out there and go. Take your helmet off and breathe the air and animals and all these other things. That's what you want. That's why you want interstellar flight, is so that you can go find a new Earth. But interstellar flight is virtually impossible, this guy's going to say. And rather than going all of that distance, which we don't think can be done anyway, because of your longing for a kind of a planet, for a kind of a world, what I propose is doing what's far easier than this, and that is altering our human DNA so that what we desire are small, cramped, metallic spaces built into icy worlds. That's what we want. That's what we long for. It's far easier to do. Far easier. He makes a compelling case. And then he strangles a puppy right on stage, which practically gets him killed, but he basically, so you wouldn't see that obviously, but he basically says, see, that emotional reaction of yours is wired into you, the same thing as this desire to go walk out on green grass, and we can take that out. We can do it. And he can, and they will be able to. And one of the things that's so interesting about envisioning an alternate future of alternate humans like that is, if you had them based in space long enough, I think it was Arthur C. Clarke who said that, it was one of the early novels of Arthur C. Clarke where he basically said, a guy who was, one of his people was legless, and he had an enormous advantage in weightless environment. And he said he was amputee, double amputee. He did much better in 0G because he didn't have all that mass, that useless mass to pull around. So basically, if you're talking about a species that's going to go ahead and genetically modify themselves to the environment rather than the other way around, and you understand the fact that no matter what you see in the movies, asteroids are essentially 0G. You don't walk on the surface of an asteroid. You float over the surface. It's like floating in space. Surface gravity is 1,000th of a G, if that, on the big ones. So if you want to take that to its logical conclusion, you might say the way to explore space is to modify humans so that they like small enclosed spaces. They really, really like it. And then you could say, instead of these arms and a useless pair of legs, which we're never going to use, and just take up all this food to feed and mass and all this other stuff, why not just give us 4 arms? Why not just grow a second pair of arms out of our pelvic bones there, and then we could grab onto things more, and we're never going to be in a gravity field anyway. What difference does it make? And then you get to things like, if you had a semi-sterile environment, you'd have to solve the problem of like bacteria in the gut and so on. But if you had a space environment that was somewhat sterile, you'd have a chance to sterilize an environment in space anyway. Then you would have creatures that wouldn't have an immune system, wouldn't need it, and would look at earthbound humans the way that is interesting from a storytelling point of view. It's interesting to write dialogue for humans, transhumans, people from Homo sapiens stock who've genetically modified themselves, that have, maybe they don't have a nose because they don't need a nose. There's just an open cavity there. What do they need a nose for? You need a nose to filter out dirt. There is no dirt in their environment. Nose is not what they want. It's horrible. Horrible, 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 but really, really cool. And they have 4 arms or 8 arms or no arms or whatever. And they look at us as the original humans, as unmodified humans, as literally beasts that, most importantly, are literally swimming in filth. They would look at us and keep us in, they'd have to keep us in isolation, because the armies of bacteria that's on the surface of our skin right now, even after coming out of the shower, the millions of bacteria that are all over us all the time, would kill them instantly, not to mention all the various diseases that we carry internally. And they would look at us as filth and worthy of extermination if they had the means, I would think. You can certainly make that case, right? I think there was a sci-fi novel about this. I think it was called The Chemically Pure Warriors, a little short story about guys who were so in space for so long that they no longer had an immune system, or they didn't have the ability to walk out on a planet. But you would basically just construct human bodies for that particular environment. If you decided that you were going to be in 0G all the time, you wouldn't need legs at all. If you were going to be in microgravity or something, you'd design a human that way. Maybe they'd look like spiders, who knows? But if you could get out of the psychological revulsion of it, and you could do that genetically too, you might find yourself with a species of extremely high intellectual capability who may make a decision that they don't like us at all. And I think the other way to go, and I'm going to do both, because I think kind of see through. Look, nobody knows, right? Nobody knows. It's all speculation. It's part of fun being a sci-fi writer or writer in general. You get to play. But in my deep future, I actually see 3 different kind of, let's call them bloodlines for sake of a better word. One is the people that decide that humanity is humanity and we're going to stay humans, and that's kind of the James T. Kirk or Alan Shepard in a spam cam, where we're going to be people just like us, and we're going to fly to other planets, and we're going to be fully human. That's one way to go. The second way would be to genetically modify humans for their environment, and the third way would be cybernetics, where you basically would take machines and bring them into the human body, or put the human brain inside a machine, or translate the entire human consciousness into machines, that kind of thing. So anyway, that's all interesting, but that image is very evocative, probably impossible, but very, very evocative. And speaking of evocative images, we have this one. Now, I'm told that this was a design for a full-scale enterprise in Las Vegas as a casino, and that it was considered seriously enough to do blueprints and economic studies, and it was canceled. And I don't know. I would like to have enough money eventually so that I can just build this, even if it's in my own backyard. I would go to this thing all the time. I'd never leave it. I mean, good God in heaven, what a brilliant idea that is. Just the sight of it would make Vegas just even more badass than it already is. I suppose it's impractical for any number of reasons, but you know what? So is building a big black pyramid too. And Vegas pulled that off, and it's impractical to build an Eiffel Tower, and it's impractical to build all these things that they build in Vegas, so why not do it? Look at that. How magnificent would that be? How cool would that be? I know it's Geekville and stuff, but there's enough geeks to keep this thing in business. I mean, honest to God, who would ever stay in another place if you had a chance to go like this to Vegas and you were a nerd? I just think it's absolutely cool. Really cool. And I think it's as cool in its own way as this idea to rebuild the Titanic. I think they're actually doing that. That's certainly a sounder business model than this. I could see why this wouldn't succeed. But the idea of building a modern Titanic, a vessel that for all intents and purposes looked exactly like the Titanic, had all, in order to do this and make it work, you would have to have all of the staterooms be period. Everything, it would have to be the Titanic, except that the engine room would be modern, and needless to say, interesting question on what you do with lifeboats, because Titanic didn't have enough. But that kind of thing is neat. I just think it's cool. But this is mind-boggling. I'd never seen it before, and when I saw it, I about lost my mind. It's an incredible image. It's very, 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 very cool. So, yeah, there that is. We'll go a little faster here. Let's see, this one. This is the Grammar Nazi. And I don't know if it was selected because of the skinny tie or anything, but I just wanted to make one comment about it. It's not the grammar issue that I'm interested in. I'm interested in how I'm just interested in how much more interesting the 60s were than the present day because of the dress, because the genders dress so differently. I've been watching The Twilight Zone all the way through on Hulu Plus, been watching every episode in order. And the one thing that strikes me the most is just how stunning those women were. People like Inger Johnson, I guess, and Susan Oliver, and just how stunningly good looking they were. But I think what I'm trying to point out here is simply this. I've seen two examples of it. The first one is Mad Men, and you look at John Hamm as Don Draper, and just how interesting he is, and how masculine he is, and how strong he looks, and how just interesting and tough. He just looks, I don't know. He looks like a man, and he's got this magnetism, and the women look great too. And then you see John Hamm on an interview, and he's got the growth, and his hair is all, and he's wearing a T-shirt and jeans, and I don't know. It's just it just seems childish to me. It seems childish to me, and got an even bigger shock out of that when I saw The Artist, which is that magnificent black and white film. It's just terrific. The second that lead character stepped on stage, you like him. I mean, he's the smile and the look and everything. And again, he's always in a tuxedo, or he's in a suit, and his hair's back, and the women are wearing these gowns and dresses and stuff. And then I saw them both interviewed, both the leads in the Artist, and the guy, he's got the shaggy hair and the lack of shave, and he's wearing a T-shirt, and they ask him questions, and he's just mumbling. Brilliant actor, don't get me wrong. And the girl who used to be so beautiful is kind of the same thing. They're virtually indistinguishable, these two. They're both so androgynous, and she's doing her thing, and I thought they're just so less interesting. I know they're actors, and characters are more interesting than actors. I get that, I do, but it's just less interesting. I'm not saying we need to go back to it. I'm not saying any of that stuff. I'm just saying that this look, this 1960s, early 60s look is, I think, just great. And every time I see anything like this, I just think of a civilization at the height of its powers. I don't know. It's obviously nostalgic for me personally. It's, time I grew up in. It's how my dad used to dress, and I just thought before the 60s turned sour at the end, and before the horrid 70s came along, I had a tie in high school that was wide enough to land a jet on. It was it's a James Lilacs refers to the 70s as the wide decade. Those horrible lapels that came out, to your shoulders, and, ties that were this wide with a knot that was, as thick as your fist. It's just horrible. Just look at Anchorman and you realize what appalling taste that was, in lime green jumpsuits and, So anyway, that's why I came back to this image. I just think it's, I don't know. I like it. I think it looks good, and I think it's just cool. And I like the fact that you had to get dressed up when you went out. You used to get dressed up when you were flying. You couldn't get on an airplane in a T-shirt. You had to dress like this to get on an airplane. First time I got on an airplane was a Pan Am 707. And you had to wear a shirt and a tie, and everybody. I don't know. I just thought it was better, but your mileage may vary. This one's real quick, but this reminded me of something. It's a classic line from Star Wars where they're looking down on Mos Eisley Starport, and it's the first time you really get a sense of the character for Ben Kenobi. Mos Eisley Starport, you will never find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. And obviously that's Washington, D.C. down below. The reason I brought this up is because it's absolutely true, and occasionally I'll go out on the show and I'll say, of all the things that disturb me about this power grab and this, just this unbelievable, unrelenting nastiness of Washington. And Washington has always been nasty. You go back to Mark Twain's time or everybody else. Politicians are awful. They're just awful people. They always have been, pretty much of both parties. But the reason I wanted to bring this image in was because I have a theory, and I really believe it. I mean, to me, it's such an enormous insult that one of the 2 or 3 men in all of history who actually walked away from power, they named the city after him in his honor, and now it's nothing but a giant power grab. Washington is a term of disdain and disgust, and has been really since there's been a capital called Washington. And I've said this before on speaking engagements. If I were influential senator or House of Representatives or something, or president, I would try to pass a bill renaming Washington, D.C. Arnoldville. I'd rename it Arnoldville after Benedict Arnold, because that's the reputation the town has and deserves. And I would keep calling it Arnoldville until we had a budget that was balanced, and we had a Congress that obeyed the laws, and a government that obeyed the laws, including things like, the NSA and the CIA and everything. When everything was back in its box and the Constitution was being followed and we were passing budgets and Congress was meeting, I'd rename it Washington. But until then, I'd call it Arnoldville, because that's what it is. It's nowhere will you find a more wretched hive of scum and villainy. It's just appalling. It's absolutely appalling. And it's a great disgrace to George Washington that his name is spoken of with disdain and with a little spit. Washington. It's you got to be careful about what you ask for there. That wasn't really too good. This one's kind of fun. I've got a defense segment on the virtual presidency series, and I talk about this particular set of aircraft. On the top is an A-10 Thunderbolt II, more popularly known as the Warthog. It was built in the late 70s under the auspices of a guy, I want to say his name is Sperry, at the Pentagon. It was one of the fighter mafia, along with John Boyd, who decided that we had to build airplanes that actually worked for their purpose rather than what the contractors wanted and the four-stars wanted. So they built the A-10, and they also built the F-15 and the F-16, and all three aircraft were superb. The F-15 is a kill ratio, I think right now, unless it's changed, the kill ratio of the F-15. Prior to the F-15 in Vietnam, the U.S. air-to-air ratio fell to 2-1 and may have been even lower. But along comes a guy named John Boyd and some of his acolytes, and they start designing airplanes that will actually win dogfights and win in air-to-air combat. And you go from 2-1 in Vietnam. It was 14-1 in Korea, 2-1 in Vietnam, and now the air-to-air combat score for the F-15 is 172-0. 172 aircraft shot down by the F-15 against 0 losses. All right. The A-10 is a similar aircraft in terms of its record. It's a very different aircraft in terms of its mission. A-10 was designed for one purpose only, and that's ground attack. Ground attack, close air support missions are essential. In fact, the whole reason why you have air superiority in the first place is so that you can support the troops on the ground. You got to win the fight in the sky so that you can then use the skies to help your guys on the ground. And the A-10 is absolutely unmatched at that. It's a slow airplane by Air Force standards, subsonic airplane. It's ugly by the accounts of people who think that it's ugly. I don't think it's ugly. I think it's gorgeous. And it's designed to take ground fire. It's got a titanium bathtub, not the whole airplane because it'd be too heavy, but they put a titanium bathtub around the pilot so it can withstand virtually any kind of ground fire, small arms fire to say the least, and heavier rounds as well. They got the engines up high above the wings to help reduce the thermal signature. Multiply redundant flight control systems. They've shot the living hell out of these airplanes. They come back home. They land. They bring the pilot back. And last but not least, since it's so slow, it's able to loiter over the battlefield and give the pilot enough time to deploy that gun, which you can't see underneath there very well. It's the size of a bus, the size of a school bus. That gun makes the most distinctive sound in the world. They built the airplane around the gun. If you look at the airplane from the front dead on, you'll see that the front landing gear strut is actually not in the middle of the airplane. It's off to the side because they got to move the landing gear to make room for the gun. When that gun is firing, it makes a sound against anything that you just can't imagine the sound. It's extremely high rate of fire. If you depleted uranium bullets coming down. And they just go right through a tank. Anything that it hits with it, it just disappears. So it's a superb weapon. And carried a lot of air-to-ground missiles as well, a lot of Mavericks and stuff. It's a superb weapon. Worked perfectly. And finally, it's inexpensive. It's not an expensive airplane. It's not gold-plated. It's actually very simple. It's simple, effective, and it works. And the pilots loved it. So needless to say, it has to be replaced. And what they wanted to replace it with is the F-35, which is located below it. The F-35 is not only one of the A-10 is one of the least expensive airplanes in the inventory, and it's a very inexpensive airplane to make. The F-35 is the most expensive airplane ever built. The F-35 has stealth capabilities, but the A-10 didn't need stealth capabilities. The F-35 can't carry the range, the load, and the F-35 cost, I don't even know what, multiples, 100 times maybe, whatever, of what the A-10 did. And the A-10, which worked, is being phased out for the F-35, which is not working because of politics. And it's not only costing us a fortune, it's going to cost pilots. The F-35 will not be able to survive what the A-10 survives. The F-35 can't even get the thing flying. And this is exactly what's wrong with American defense procurement right now in these two pictures. We're trading in something that's inexpensive, well-loved, well-understood, perfect for its mission, which could have been upgraded with avionics updates. Not that it particularly needed them. And it's not that the pilots of the A-10 were going, God, please, please, please get us out of the A-10. They loved it because it works, and the enemy feared this airplane more than anything we had. But no, it worked perfectly, and it's cheap, and we own them, so we're going to throw them away, and we're going to replace them with this gold-plated boondoggle called the F-35. The F-35 is a very capable aircraft when it works within certain conditions, but you can't have an airplane that expensive doing this close air support role. I think the F-35 program is the biggest defense mistake we ever made. In that defense procurement episode, I talk about stopping the F-35 and restarting the F-22. The F-22 is where we should have put our assets in terms of stealth. F-22, if you have an F-22, which we know is working, and the F-22 is in the sky working as an air-to-air fighter. The F-22 is never designed to do anything, but if we had enough F-22s, you wouldn't need stealth on the F-35, right? If you had enough F-22s, Raptors, which is astonishing air-to-air aircraft, then, unless I'm missing the point, you send in your stealth fighters, which are not just stealthy like the F-117, which was not a dogfighter. It was a terrible airplane. It just barely flew, but it was stealthy. You take an F-22 in there with guys that know what they're doing, and you simply eliminate the enemy's air defenses. And once the enemy's air defenses are eliminated, you can take out whatever you want to with A-10s because they're not going to face enemy airplanes, and they just take them out. Take out the enemy air force and take out the enemy air defense. Once you get their air force out of the way, then you can take out their air defenses because then you can use standoff missiles to take out their SAM batteries and take out their AAA. Just do it like that. You go in with the air-to-air, clear the skies from enemy fighters. Then you've got fighter cover. Your fighter cover goes in there, puts a cap over the battlefield. Your your Iron Hand mission guys, the guys that are doing anti-air defense suppression, come in and take out the SAM batteries in the AAA installations, and then there's nothing that can touch an airplane, and the A-10s go in there and have a field day and just kill tanks and armored personnel carriers. I don't know. That's how it seems to work to me, and I'm not a super genius when it comes to this kind of thing. I just read a little. It seems pretty nearly what you would need to do. So rather than spending all of the gold on airplanes that don't need to be gold, why don't we just buy more gold in F-22s, enough so that we can actually deploy them, and then keep the A-10s and pass the savings on to the taxpayer? I don't know. I'm old-fashioned that way. Hold on time. I'll do a couple more. This is not something you see much of any day. This is a space colony. When I was a kid in the 70s, becoming a teenager in the 70s, these kind of things were real common. They were, colonies in space and Lagrange points, and we're going to put all this stuff up there, and sweet. It's an awful lot of weight. It's a lot of mass to get into orbit. How are you going to get that up there? I mean, one of the things that we talk about is big dumb rockets. Sometimes they make economic sense. X-Corps is going to land their first stage on this next mission. They're going to fly the booster back. If they do that, it's a game changer. But I think there's a deeper issue here than this. And this is not just a structure. This is a vision of Eden, right? This is the new world, and this is what people like us who want to be left alone and who work hard and expect to be rewarded for it. I think that's really the appeal of these space colonies, is not so much the technological challenge, because it's not as nice as living on Earth. It's kind of like, in the very best case, living in Disneyland. But it's not a metallic hole in the side of a comet or a Spam can. It feels a bit like home, and it's free. It's a new frontier. And look, the appeal of the frontier is getting away from the idiots, right? Getting away from the masses and the idiots. People went out west and took the risk and gave up relative security of the cities for the danger of Indians and bears and all those other things, because they wanted to be left alone. They wanted to have a chance to make their own lives. And you can kind of figure that if you do this in space, you're going to, at least in the initial stages, select out the idiots. They'll come sooner or later, don't you worry. But nevertheless. This also reminds me a little bit of Elysium, which I've got on my watch list. I just haven't had the stomach for it yet. I'd like to see it. But the thing about Elysium that's so dreadful, just from what I've read and heard, is the idea that that's where all the wealthy people are, and they're sucking the wealth out of the planet. When in point of fact, what they're really doing is whatever medicines or whatever technologies they've developed is trickling down to the planet. We don't suck resources out of the third world. We just don't. We certainly don't steal them. To the degree that we may get magnesium or something from Africa, we pay for it. And we pay for it with money that people in Africa can use to buy things that they can't make on their own, like AK-47s, for example, or anything else for that matter, or Mercedes. This idea that the wealthy take the stuff out of the planet and then go and live, by pulling all these other people's resources is absolutely backwards. I did the math on this when I did that thing on American exceptionalism. If we took everything in Djibouti, if we sent the Marine Corps into Djibouti and took all of the gross national product of Djibouti, it'd run the United States economy for, I think it was 4.5 hours, something like that. There's not enough wealth in the third world to run the U.S. economy if we stole everything. On the contrary, what happens is it's the economy of the United States that pushes wealth out into the third world. We pay hundreds and hundreds, billions of dollars every year of money that we make through work that we do here in America gets pushed out for things like military bases. We send out billions of dollars a year in foreign aid. And, of course, we trade with people and give them billions of dollars worth of trade that they wouldn't have had. This thing about the rich stealing the resources of the poor is just not true. The rich work harder and smarter. They're better suited to succeed. They produce products and services that can't be produced by people elsewhere. And then they trade them for things that those people can produce and give them the things that they never could get. Why do you think there's cell phones in Papua New Guinea? Because whatever Papua New Guinea exports that we are interested in, we trade for cell phones. They can't make cell phones. Forget Papua New Guinea. Why are there cell phones in Saudi Arabia? The Saudis can't make cell phones. The Saudis can't make Mercedes. The Saudis cannot, forget build, they can't even maintain their own oil derricks. They have a resource, which we could steal if we wanted to because we're strong enough. We could simply go in there and take it, but we don't. We buy it. We take the work that you and I do every day, high-level hard work, because we work hard. It's 8 o'clock at night here, and I'm still here, and I'm going to be here till 10:30, 11 o'clock tonight working on other stuff. I do this 6, 7 days a week, and the wealth that I generate and the wealth that you generate is traded out into the third world and allows them to buy things they never could have otherwise. Elysium has it exactly, precisely 100% backwards. 100%. So, what they don't like is what they hate about this idea. What the progressives hate about this idea is when you really get down to it, they're terrified on some level, maybe even subconsciously, terrified that the producers will leave. Because we always have. They're terrified of it. I think that's why they've stopped NASA. I think that's why they stopped the nuclear rocket program. They're terrified that we'll leave. Because if the producers leave, they're done. It's another arcade thing, but I'm not going to go into that again. They're done. This is the frontier. This is not Disneyland. This is not suburbia. It's a frontier where people can be left alone and succeed on their own and be around other people that want to be left alone and succeed on their own. I got 2 more to do. I like this one a lot. I saw this a while ago and it really made an impression on me. Not really much to say over this other than this is the precious snowflake mentality in a nutshell. The idea that you're so unique and so different and so special and so wonderful. This is why they're failing so badly in schools. I keep saying this, and I just have to keep saying it, I guess. I come down hard on these millennials and stuff for the sort of lack of mental toughness. But as was pointed out to me by one of them, that's not their fault. It's their parents' fault. That idea that everything you do is a gold medal and everything you do is a gold star and you're the smartest and the best looking and the most successful and the happiest kid all the time, it's wrong. And the idea of the self-esteem movement is backwards. You don't give people self-esteem. You can't give somebody self-esteem. You have to earn it. It's a reward for yourself. You can teach them self-love. That's a little different. But you can't just say, you're all winners, because people know that you're not all winners. If everybody's a winner, the term winner means nothing. It means nothing. And people know that. And so what you get is people who don't know how to compete, and you get people who don't know how to deal with any kind of hardship. And you're seeing stories of people now in their 30s and 40s, living at home, unable to do their laundry, can't possibly imagine the idea of having their own apartment. I see more and more people who are in their 20s now, early 20s, mid-20s, who are still being driven around by their parents. They don't know how to drive, or they don't want to. So there you go. That's that. It's a catastrophe. The way you get self-esteem is by accomplishing something and going through hardship and failing till you succeed. Then you get a little bit of self-pride. So as we say here, just because you're unique doesn't mean that you're useful. Try being useful. 2 other things that I'm going to rail through really fast here, and we'll call it a night. This is called The National Debt and Federal Budget Deficit Demonstrated by Tony Robbins, famed international millionaire or billionaire. This look at all familiar to you? I had heard that he had done my Eat the Rich thing, which, as I gave full credit in the beginning and the end, the numbers of which were crunched by my friend Iowa Hawk. But Iowa Hawk is my friend. I asked for his permission to do it, and then I cut those down and wrote it in my own language and did Eat the Rich. Now, I had heard that Tony Robbins had done a version of this, and I'd heard it was very similar to me, but somebody just put this in there, and it's like, that's not very similar. That's word for word verbatim. And it doesn't look as good as mine either. And Tony Robbins is a multi-millionaire. And it pisses me off, frankly. That's just a 100% ripoff. And, I don't know. I'm really, really quite surprised In fact, I'm very surprised. In fact, this is really the whole thing that bothers me, is that Tony Robbins is a guy who apparently made his living by talking about hard work and and motivation and getting out there he gets paid lots of money. I know when I used to work on Sunday Morning Shootout with Peter Bart and Peter Goober would go on retreats with this guy, and he got paid big money for all of his motivational stuff. And if all of this motivational stuff comes down to stealing somebody else's stuff verbatim, then maybe Tony Robbins isn't what he should cracked up to be. I had heard about it and forgotten about it, but when somebody showed me that picture, I'd never seen it, and I hadn't realized it was. I mean, frankly, look, if you go back to this thing, it's the same exact calendar, it's the same exact white, it's the same exact Super Bowl graphics. I may even be in that picture, and maybe he just superimposed himself over me, made himself just slightly larger. I don't know, but man, that's pretty shocking. So, showed up in our picture section. I thought I'd give it 60 seconds. And here's the final thing. I think this is from a show. It's obviously from a show. I don't know what show it is. So if you put it in there because you wanted me to talk about the show or the character, I almost remember the show. I know he's a person of interest. That's what it is. I've never seen Person of Interest, but I've met Jim Caviezel a couple times, and I just wanted to say a word or two about Jim Caviezel. Jim Caviezel is, I think, a terrific actor, number one. Caviezel is extremely handsome, as you can see here, number two. And I say all of this simply to say that Jim Caviezel should be Brad Pitt or George Clooney. He should be all of those guys. He's got the talent. He's got the looks. He's got that burning look. But Jim Caviezel is none of these things because Jim Caviezel is a conservative. And Jim Caviezel was in The Passion of the Christ. And that is a sin that is, needless to say, unforgivable. That you could be a conservative in Hollywood and be a big success. So I picked up this picture of Jim Caviezel only to say that Caviezel, I think, is living proof of the fact that you cannot live up to your principles openly in Hollywood and survive it. You can make a living, but you can't be what Caviezel is and should be, and that is a bona fide movie star. Caviezel, there are actors and there are movie stars. A few movie stars can act, but the good ones can. Maybe not super well. Tom Cruise is not a good actor. I've never seen Tom Cruise in anything I particularly believe, but Tom Cruise is entertaining because he's Tom Cruise. Caviezel, on the other hand, is a movie star and an actor, and so is George Clooney, and so is Brad Pitt, and much as I hate to say it, so is Matt Damon. And Caviezel is in that league. He's got the looks, he's got the character, the personality to be a movie star, and he's got the chops of an actor that would allow him to be at that top level. And it didn't happen. And it didn't happen because of Passion of the Christ. And I imagine that if I'm Jim Caviezel, I'd be fairly PO'd at Mel Gibson. Because I happen to like Mel Gibson. I think Mel Gibson is a guy who's really, really tormented. And some of the things Mel Gibson said, I don't believe in political correctness, needless to say, and I don't believe in any of this oversensitivity and people getting all, weepy about this and that. But some of the things that Mel Gibson has said are just plain offensive. They're just over the line, obnoxious, and he seems to have meant them. That's the funny thing about being drunk, is he seems to have meant them. So Gibson is a very, very, very tormented, unhappy guy, and he has my genuine sympathy because I think he's a great filmmaker, and I think he's a great patriot in a lot of ways. I mean, The Patriot's a great movie, and the Wallace film is maybe the greatest film about freedom ever. But he's got some real problems, and so here's Caviezel, who's makes a decision to be in what everybody knew was going to be a firestorm. It was called Gibson's Folly. It was called Gibson's Folly on the show that I worked on. I saw them getting ready for Passion of the Christ. It was about 2007, I guess. And I was in editing the show when Mel Gibson came on, and the show had already opened, Passion of the Christ, not Braveheart, and Gibson was already dealing with these charges of anti-Semitism, and he was dealing with them from a guy like Peter Cooper, who's Jewish, and Gibson was, I thought, giving great answers. I mean, I thought he was giving really great answers, and providing Caviezel with the kind of cover he needed, so that when Gibson goes off and starts making all those comments about the Jews, all of the charges of anti-Semitism in the movie were validated. I don't think that's a correlation. I don't think that the anti-Semitism is necessarily in the movie, but nevertheless, it gave them that, and I think that stuck to Caviezel. And I don't know. I just really like Jim Caviezel. I think he's a really, really solid guy. He's a very quiet guy. In the limited times I've met him, I've had a chance to say hi to him a couple times, and he's a quiet, very serious, decent guy. And I really liked him very much. And I think he's paid a price for his personal political beliefs, and he's not the only one. So, anyway, I think that'll do it for the night. There's 2 hours and 1 minute. It's your Stratosphere Lounge Part 2 of Pictures Worth 1,000 Words. And I think we'll probably not do these for a while. It's easy to kind of go off on tangents when you're not really on a particular topic. So, whole point of this is kind of free associate ideas and stuff. So hopefully it was worth it to you. I had a good time. It's always interesting to see some of these things. Pictures really are worth 1,000 words. I mean, honestly, you look at this and you worry about your world today, and you worry if you got the fortitude to deal with another day of Barack Obama pushing back the Obamacare deadline, and then you look at this guy and you think, nope, they're 20 miles away and they're going to kill them all. We are going to die choking. Each last one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground. That's fortifying for me. I don't know if it's fortifying for you, but it's fortifying for me. So, again, thanks for everything. It's always a pleasure to see you guys and working out the last of the bugs here. And I think we'll probably do it next Thursday. We'll give you a little warning. It's great to see all of you. Thanks again for joining us. And I think I'm going to go to the TSR, Common Sense Resistance logo, because I think for some reason my silent logo isn't silent, but we'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.